This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. Prediction markets successfully called President Trump's election victory. So what could be next? From the Fed's next move to the monthly jobs report, we talked to Kalshi and Interactive Brokers about how event contract exchanges work and why they're not simply a new form of betting. And the story of the dangers and lost revenue from methane leaks, with new technology coming online to help natural gas producers do well by doing good and helping stop valuable product from simply escaping into the atmosphere. But we start with the big story on the minds of Wall Street this week and likely to be every week going forward. President Trump's continuing announcements of sweeping changes in U.S. economic policy. Larry Summers of Harvard has been at the center of policymaking and negotiation at the Treasury and in the White House.
This is the beginning of making America rich again.
We continue to hear about tariffs. I mean, first it was Colombia for a short time, then it was Canada and Mexico suspended, then China. Now this week it was steel and aluminum, reportedly for the entire world starting in March. What do you make of what's going on with the tariff situation, insofar as we can tell?
Look, the steel and aluminum tariffs, which have been imposed, are a uniquely bad policy. They're a uniquely bad policy because 50 times as many workers work or more work in industries that use steel and aluminum as work in the steel and aluminum industry. So even if you protect a few jobs or a certain number of jobs in steel and aluminum, the jobs you lose in the downstream industries that have to compete, industries like cars, industries like construction, are far more than any benefit you save in steel. One estimate found that it was more than $700,000 per job saved in burdens on consumers, and that's even before you get to the costs of the jobs lost in automobiles and construction. And Lydia Cox at Yale has done a hugely important study where she's looked at what happened with past steel tariff exercises, when President Bush did it in the early 2000s, when President Trump imposed it in the 2018 period. And what she found is that when you take the tariffs off, things don't go back, that people have disrupted their normal relationships, and so the damage to competitiveness is permanent, even from a temporary tariff increase. And that says that all this jockeying around, threatening, putting them on, taking them off, is going to create a real cost to our economy in terms of the uncertainty. Less than 0.1% of people, the workers in the United States, are in these two industries, but it's so important downstream that even if you thought tariffs were a good strategy sometimes in general to use as a bargaining chip, starting with steel and aluminum seems to me to be exactly the wrong place to start, precisely because they're such an important input to so many things.
Some say that dramatic announcements on things like tariffs are really only a negotiating tool. This from a president whose memoir from 1987 was The Art of the Deal. The book traces President Trump's real estate career and the path he took to make his name a brand. Stephanie Flanders is the head of government and economics for Bloomberg News and the host of the new podcast, Trumponomics. We asked her what the art of the deal really is.
His first rule of Art of the Deal was to think big, but also to speak big and to make sometimes, have outlandish plans or extravagant real estate schemes which overturn the chessboard and unsettle his adversaries in a way that ends up benefiting him. We clearly saw that in the first term with the, saying he's going to force Mexico to pay for the wall, the way he put all of his NATO allies on the back foot by saying he was threatening to withdraw from NATO, which seemed like an extraordinary thing, but actually did instill change. So this is something we've seen before.
We've seen leaders think big, take big positions. Often we want them to do that. But it's not just big, but it's many. I mean, it's across a wide range of subjects. It seems like every day we get several new policy pronouncements coming out of the White House.
I mean, I think obviously the sort of journalistic sort of conspiracy theory or suspicion is that this is partly a way to make it very hard for people to focus on everything that's going on at the same time. You know, the flood the zone strategy. But I do think also it's the level of ambition that you see on multiple fronts. And, you know, I guess there's an element of, you know, Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. There's the so-called madman theory of diplomacy that you saw from Richard Nixon. It's this idea that you behave so erratically on so many different fronts that you actually convince people that you could be about to do something crazy if they don't change the way they're looking at something. So we have seen that before. I think the shock this time, particularly around the economic threats, is the apparent willingness to turn the volume up to a max or 11 on major economic relationships in pursuit of actually quite small gains. I mean, we saw him sort of effectively threaten to blow up America's most important economic relationships over tariffs.
I look at some of the deals made, I say, who the hell made these deals that are so bad?
But that uncertainty is definitely a bug for business. Is it a bug for Donald Trump, or is it a feature? I mean, that's something I can't quite get my head around. Maybe he likes that uncertainty.
I think he does like the uncertainty as a negotiating tactic. We saw that. I think it's particularly true on the geopolitical stage. We saw it with North Korea negotiations. We've seen it in other areas. I think with the economics, he uses it up to a point. But we've seen in the past, we saw certainly in the way he dealt with China in the first term, once there appear to be quite widespread economic costs for the US, that's when he goes into deal-making mode and becomes much more conciliatory. We saw that in the first term when they had moved through quite targeted tariffs against China that didn't affect ordinary consumers. Once they went to the Class 4A products, which I'm sure you've memorized all the terms of these negotiations, David, but once they went to the group of large number of consumer goods, mobile phones, all these things that people actually buy, that's when you started to see a macroeconomic hit, investment falling, consumption weakening, the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates, and that was when he sort of pushed the negotiators to do quite a rapid deal with China.
One of the challenges in taking on very big challenges is actually trying to measure success and get something done. How will we measure success for Donald Trump? And maybe as important, do we have any sense of how he measures success in his negotiations?
I think he declares success, and we know that he's done that many times, and he indeed declared success when he renegotiated the NAFTA and created these new trade deals, which I think did change the game, were more favourable to the US in certain ways. I think, again, it's harder for us to see with this administration because if you set very high targets, you know, the full balancing of global trade, a system in which America gets full advantage of all its trading relationships, it's quite hard to see where the benefit lies. But if he has managed to extract a change in behaviour from other countries around the world, if he extracts a lot more defence spending from European governments and doesn't tank the US economy in the process of doing all of this kind of throwing up of the chessboard, then I'm sure he would consider that a success, and many others will too.
I expect that a good number of investors in our audience are trying to figure out how to respond with their investments. How do they position themselves? From your experience, as I say, both in government and covering business and economics for so many years, what advice do you have for investors about how to respond to this?
Well, I think we always would say try not to respond to everything. And I think in this case, you would be changing your portfolio 25 times a day if you were listening to everything coming out of the White House. I think the general approach of considering where the market is and how much, if you like, is already priced in, and trying to sort of keep your eyes on the sort of longer term picture. You know, is this a business-friendly environment? Is the market priced for the best of all possible Trumps with no downside to economic activity from all this uncertainty? There has to be a question mark about that.
Coming up, the difference between betting and making money off of projections. We explore the brave new world of those prediction markets that got the last presidential election right. This is a story about the future. Just about all of us have hunches about what's coming next. From who's going to win March Madness to who will get the Oscar for Best Picture. Many of us put our money where those hunches are, at casinos, in betting on sports, and some might even say in playing the markets.
Whenever I bet, I could change the odds for every bookmaker in the country.
There's like $1 million riding on that game.
Oh, there's like a whole lot more than that.
Now there's a new game in town, one that's regulated not as gaming, but as a market. Something that moved into the spotlight by beating the polls in predicting the results of the most recent presidential election.
I believe the greatest political movement of all time. There's never been anything like this in this country and maybe beyond.
These prediction markets are based on event contracts, traded on an open exchange. And they told us to expect a Trump win weeks before the election. So, what is an event contract?
Event contracts are basically yes or no questions about upcoming events. And people form various opinions and expectations about them. And we ask them, what do they think the probability is that the event is going to happen or it is not going to happen? And we ask that in the way where we say that you can buy a yes or a no answer, and if you are correct, we will pay you $1. So therefore, the appropriate price for buying a yes or a no is the probability that the outcome will be the yes or the no.
Thomas Peterffy is the founder of Interactive Brokers, a brokerage firm that launched its own prediction website last year called ForecastX.
ForecastX currently deals with climate questions, economic indicators, political questions. In the future, it will deal with questions having to do with the economy, having to do with cultural developments, having to do with demographic questions, and basically the large questions that people are faced with in their lives.
I think our goal with prediction markets is really to allow every person that has an opinion on something to find that market and that big event that they care about to be able to trade on.
ForecastX isn't the first or the only prediction market in the United States. Founded in 2018 and launched in 2021, Kalshi is the first CFTC-regulated exchange, and it's taken the market by storm. Kalshi's app has been downloaded about 2 million times, and it's seen nearly $2 billion in contracts. Luana Lopez Lara is the company's co-founder and COO.
While we were in MIT, one thing we realized is that most trading happens when you have an opinion about what's going to happen in the future and you find a way to put that in the market. So you think this country is going to go into a recession, or you think this person is going to win an election, or Brexit's going to happen, and you find a way to express that view in the market to hedge some risk that you have, or also to get exposure to something. And what we realized was there should be a better way to do it. And for us, it was, why is there no direct exchange that you can just trade directly on what you think is going to happen?
Kalshi saw around $500 million put down on the 2024 election, but its value might not be in the money placed, but in what it told us. Kalshi's prediction market had Trump comfortably ahead of Kamala Harris in the lead up to the election, even as polls saw Harris narrowly ahead.
Prediction markets, and Kalshi in particular, got a lot of attention because of the most recent presidential election, in which the polls sort of showed it was really close. And you said not so much. Why was there such difficulty in getting approval for that? Because you had to fight the CFTC, as I recall.
After we launched in 2021, a couple months after, we realized that we really needed to add presidential elections. It's a big event that has massive impact throughout the world and the country. As you can see what's happening now with tariffs and everything, they're so tied to this event. And we started engaging with the CFTC. They had a lot of concerns that it would destroy democracy, that people would change their votes based on who they would vote for, and things like that, or the perception that people would change their votes based on who would win. They thought it was too close to gambling and all of those things. We engaged with them for over a year, and it got to a point that we saw the only way to go forward is if we sue them. because they're just acting unlawfully. We ended up winning on the stay of the appeal to be able to list it. And I think that all of their concerns were also, after the election, proved to not be true, right? Like, we know now that the election was not manipulated by election markets, even though billions of dollars were traded. We know that it didn't destroy democracy. We know all of these things that we were saying were true are actually true. And it's great to be kind of vindicated that this was actually a great thing to actually enhance democracy, because polls were so bad. During the election season, that was kind of the narrative that we were pushing.
Was the presidential election the largest single event in your volume so far?
Yeah. Yes.
How big was it?
The actual who's going to win, I think, was like 500 million or 600 million on just that one. But we had actually markets on who's going to win Pennsylvania, for example, and the margin of victory and a lot of other, I guess, derivatives of that main event that took the pie to like over $1 billion.
For some of us who are not as familiar with prediction markets, you said earlier, it's not betting. Why is it not? Because it sort of looks and talks and walks a little bit like betting. What's the difference between a prediction market, taking an event contract, and betting?
The easiest way, I think, to explain this is we are pretty much like the New York Stock Exchange or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in terms of structure. We are a trade matching engine, right? So you can come and say, I want to take a position on this. Someone else says, I want to take a position on this. I think a big difference there is, like, we're an exchange, we're not a house. We don't make money if people lose. Let's say you think hiking rates will hurt your student loans, you can actually buy a contract that says if they hike, we'll pay. You can use that to offset, basically hedge. And I think that that's the underlying difference, is that we're an exchange. We don't offer margin. We actually pay interest on all your positions and your cash in the platform. And we offer contracts that we think are even safer, because you can have more information about a lot of the markets that we have than you have about some obscure financials of some company that you don't know about. We are fully regulated federally as an exchange and have all the supports there. But obviously people do, as in the stock market. Some people gamble, some people hedge, some people short sell. There's people do crazy things, and I think they'll do the same.
These platforms say, well, this isn't betting. This isn't sports betting, for example, when you can buy a contract on whether the Chiefs will beat the Eagles, betting against the house, against the casino, against the bookie, whatever. Here you're trading with other people. That seems to me to be a distinction that's somewhat without a difference.
Tim Massad is the former Commodity Futures Trading Commission chairman, an independent federal agency established in 1974 to regulate the United States derivatives markets. The CFTC now oversees online forecasting, and Massad says he's not against prediction markets, but has his doubts about how best to regulate them.
There wasn't much activity here. When I was chair, we had a proposal for a political contract on elections, and we limited that to a university setting where the volume was really very limited. But over the last few years, we've seen firms start up that want to do a lot more of these, and that's made the regulatory challenge really big. Congress tried to give the CFTC some tools to limit the range of these things back in 2010 when the Dodd-Frank law was passed. The Congress said the CFTC can not certify something if it determines that the contract is not in the public interest and it falls into one of basically 5 categories. It pertains to war, terrorism, assassination, an activity that's unlawful, or gaming. But those are the only categories. And it said gaming, not gambling. The CFTC put out a rule proposal last year that basically tried to take an expansive view of this as to what gaming was and to how to define public interest. If we want to allow this, that's fine, but I wouldn't make the CFTC the regulator of it. The CFTC is a small agency. It's got other things to do that I think are more central to its mission.
So why is it the CFTC's job to regulate event contracts?
It's a financial contract, and it's not married to the performance of any specific company. It is not a security. It is a commodity. The distinction between commodity or a security is kind of vague, and it's more for lawyers than people like me to say which is a commodity and which is a security.
Whoever regulates them, it certainly looks like prediction markets are here to stay. Looking to build on its success in the presidential election, Kalshi this year announced a deal with Robinhood to let people trade on contracts for the Super Bowl from their brokerage account, although the CFTC once again stepped in to put the deal on hold.
The Super Bowl obviously is a very big event, and it's in one of the events on which you took contracts. You also had a special relationship with Robinhood, but at the same time, the regulators weren't done with you yet. What is the issue there? Do you know why is the CFTC particularly concerned about that?
The same way that we opened a very big pie, in our opinion, with elections, sports are another big one, and I think we expected a bit of a scrutiny. We think they're completely legal markets that should be offered in prediction markets and CFTC-regulated exchanges as well. But I think there's just more engagement on that front from the regulators that we were somewhat expecting. In terms of the Robinhood specifics, we're very excited to expand into sports. We think that this year is going to be very, very big for us growing there. And we're excited to connect with brokers and have them with sports and mix everything together.
Exchange trading in event contracts is here, and it's regulated. But ultimately, what does it do for the markets and to the markets? Does it provide useful information to investors, or is it more a form of recreation?
You know, there's a view among economists that, or at least some economists, that, well, these are useful. They generate information, and they're more useful than polls. You can certainly argue they generate important information. A lot of, some economists at least, have said, look, these are better than polls in many cases. So I don't quarrel with that. I think they can generate interesting information. And so from that standpoint, you could say, sure, it's a public good.
We need a mechanism for people to express their views so that legislators can come out with appropriate legislation to basically channel the future for the people. And the way to do that, I think, is one way to do that, and probably the most effective way to do that, is to continuously get feedback from the population as to what legislators are trying to do, whether that is going to get the people where they want to go. So they can propose, look at, for example, the national debt. So, you know, these questions, I think, are going to be very important. And therefore, event contracts trading is going to become very important.
And perhaps most important, how big could this prediction market thing get?
How large a portion of your business is the event contract part?
At this point, it's extremely tiny.
Do you expect it to grow?
I expect it to become a huge market.
I think the prediction markets are the best way to get unbiased information about the future over a lot of different events and to get exposure directly to them. If you want to get information about the tariffs, if you want to get information about how inflation is going to be at the end of the year, the best and purest way to learn this is looking at a prediction market. We actually, our Fed markets, even though we're a lot smaller in dollar volume, outperformed CME Fed Fund Futures forecast of the Fed rates. It's just a significantly better way to get information about the future.
Coming up, as President Trump seeks to ramp up oil and gas production, leaks of methane will go up as well, unless we do something about it. We travel to Wyoming to see firsthand new technology that can help producers keep their product from escaping. That's next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about doing well by doing good. Methane leaks are a big problem for the climate, but also for gas producers.
An odorless, colorless gas, methane enters the atmosphere as leaks from natural gas production, but also from agriculture and natural sources like melting permafrost. The oil and gas industry has long treated methane leaks as an unavoidable hazard. But saving all that methane could be one of the fastest and most effective ways to fight climate change, while also conserving valuable natural gas.
So here you see a retractable tower, And at the top of the tower is a laser spectrometer.
Caroline Alden is co-founder and chief scientist of Longpath Technologies, a tech startup with a new way of detecting those methane leaks with laser-based sensors. Here in the Wyoming sagebrush steppe, near the foothills of the Wind River Mountains, pronghorn antelope and wild horses roam above one of the largest natural gas reserves in the United States. And the Jonah Field has become a proving ground for cutting-edge technology.
So the laser is going around collecting all its concentration data right up there in that little tiny box. And inside that box is a laser, a detector, and all the computing that you need to crunch the numbers on emissions from any of the well sites you can see around here.
This is a kind of a fun place to be as a climate scientist because it's a place we can all kind of row in the same direction. The industry also, doesn't want to have methane emissions. This is their product that we're keeping in the pipeline for them when we catch leaks. And so it's a real win-win where if we can give them data to help them make their operations better while also reducing emissions, that's a win-win for the climate and the industry.
In 2022, the U.S. emitted around 6 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. Methane made up about 11% of that, but it's a particularly potent and toxic gas.
Methane as a molecule is interesting because compared to CO2, which is the greenhouse gas folks are most familiar with, it's about 80 times more powerful in terms of the warming potential on a molecule per molecule basis.
Its potency makes the market for methane detection technology that much more important. And JP Morgan projects it will be more than $900 million by 2025, with a potential global market as high as $14.9 billion.
I believe this is really going to fundamentally change how operators view leak detection and repair. And I think it will change how regulators view leak detection and repair.
Howard Dieter, Jonah Energy's vice president in charge of environmental health and safety, says his goal is 24/7 monitoring using Longpath's continuous laser system, and then following up using optical gas imaging cameras and validating those measurements with drones, aircraft, and satellites.
I do think that as this technology becomes better, as it becomes more affordable to deploy, that it really is a game changer in how we think about operating and managing our facilities.
How has the whole process of detecting methane emissions changed?
So historically, the way leak detection and repair has worked, and even the way the EPA regulations and state regulations work, you're obligated to do a certain inspection once a quarter or once every 6 months or once a year, and in the intervening time you may have a leak. And so the next time you have a chance to see that leak would be 85 days following when that leak started. We're really at the precipice of moving from a schedule-driven leak detection and repair program, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually, to an actual data-driven leak detection and repair program. So we're able to roll an operator out to a site when we have something going on that they need to fix. And we fix the vast majority of things we find at the time we find them, which really reduces the time in which a leak is occurring.
Dieter recalls how a recent leak response team was dispatched to fix an outside contractor mistake at one of Jonah's production facilities.
How did you first find out about it?
Through the dashboard from Longpath. So they picked it up within the laser system. We got a notification. There was a cap on the top that hadn't been fit back, and so there was venting that was coming out of that. So within 3 hours of it being detected, noticed, we found it and fixed it.
It's product in the pipe. So every leak that we catch, it's not just reducing emissions of methane to the atmosphere, it's keeping their product in the pipe.
President Trump has made no secret about the importance he places on U.S. energy production.
We will drill, baby, drill.
But those concerned about the climate warn about the dangers of increasing methane emissions and their effect on the planet.
Police department, evacuate immediately!
Leaks are the problem with methane all around the world. Methane is 20 to 80 times more damaging than CO2, David, so it has a profound impact in adding the amount of methane in the air.
In 2023, U.S. production topped 20 billion cubic feet a day, raising the risk of more leaks and venting. New satellite technology reveals intentional emissions and hidden leaks, making it possible to shine a light on those responsible.
Now we have satellites as well, looking around the globe. What potential effect could that have actually in highlighting places in the globe and even particular producers perhaps that are really having substantial problems with methane emissions?
It definitely has increased awareness of things that are going on. Within the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, the International Methane Emissions Observatory started a program called MARS, Methane Alert and Response System, and all of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership signatories participate in that. And so we get the benefit of IMEO sending us alerts on something that's going on. So it's an extra set of eyes. And on one hand, it can be somebody kind of looking over your operations, but on the other hand, it can give you actionable data at certain levels.
Still, many operators show little sense of urgency, some pointing to difficulties in capturing the leaking methane and transporting it. Others say the economics just don't work to deploy monitoring systems across thousands of sites.
Is Jonah an outlier? I mean, you've been an early adopter. What are the attitudes within the industry? What are the various thoughts about the reaction to methane emission regulations?
We have really top-notch professionals that are experts in their fields. They like the energy industry. They believe in the energy industry, the oil and gas energy industry. They absolutely want to do the right thing. From a methane standpoint, what's interesting, Jonah was the first U.S. company to sign on to the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership in November 2020 when it was formed. And now there's over 20 U.S. companies, including majors and the largest natural gas producers in the U.S. that have signed on to that partnership. I think what we're seeing is a growing recognition that we have the ability to do this work. We have the ability to demonstrate that we produce natural gas in a very, very efficient way, and we can do it in a way that meets these regulations.
As much as people sign up for it, are they changing their behavior because of that signing up?
They are changing their behavior. Companies are using the data and information that we're collecting through this partnership and the framework in order to really understand their emissions, to deploy capital, to reduce emissions, and to position themselves really well in the market.
Environmental health and safety makes me think about past history with safety in the workplace. And we had OSHA regulations, Occupational Safety Health Administration, and it really, I think, changed a lot of American industry and the safety of workers on the premises. Do you hope and expect something similar to happen when it comes to methane emissions?
I think we're already there. A lot of the foundational change that we saw in the 70s with how safety culture changed. Methane emissions is about changing culture, and it's about helping people understand that business as usual isn't where we need to be anymore. It's not what's expected. Even when you look at the younger workforce, if we were killing 2 people a year, they wouldn't want to work here. You wouldn't want to work for a company like that. And it's the same way with emissions. If you're not continuously improving how you operate and understanding and utilizing new tools that come out, data-driven tools, then you're not attracting the best and brightest talent. People aren't going to want to work for you, and people aren't going to want your product.
As a climate scientist, are you hopeful that we actually will make some of those targets that are out there for reducing methane emissions?
I think the thing that makes me most hopeful is actually seeing that the driver for folks to use long path to reduce emissions from oil and gas, it's not necessarily just because it's the right thing to do. It's because the market drivers are evolving to push this kind of thing. It's not because the regulations are forcing you to. It's because the market is asking you to. And that makes me hopeful as a climate scientist to say, we're getting the flywheel rolling now, that this is how we need to operate in a new world, and we need to track emissions, and that's good for business.
There is little reason to think that federal regulation of methane leaks will get any tighter under the new Trump administration. One of his first executive orders on energy points the other way, which raises the question whether market forces alone will be enough to drive change. And that's where we turn next on Wall Street Week. New technology can help natural gas producers stop those damaging methane leaks. But will the market provide the needed incentives if the government does not?
There is an interest in the methane and or carbon intensity of the product that we produce, and that's for both utility customers, so they're using our product to distribute to their customers, using it to produce power, or a company that is, bringing natural gas into their system, and they're looking at an overall net zero goal.
Fixing methane leaks also helps producers like Jonah Energy meet the needs of investors and insurers.
A lot of insurers, a lot of investors today, our management team, they also look at risk and not having the ability to operate, the social license to operate, as people like to say, I think is an intangible value. It's hard to put a dollar value on that. But when we are able to say, look, we know what our emissions are, it gives our investors, it gives our insurers confidence in the work that we do.
Well, it's interesting. Do investors really ask questions about methane emissions when they decide whether to put capital into your company?
They do. There's typically a series of questions, and it isn't just emissions. It has to do with all of the things that we do environmentally on an operations basis.
Why are insurers concerned about methane emissions?
From the questions that they ask, the things they're interested in are long-term environmental issues, such as a large spill of fluid, a major release of natural gas. So understanding that we have the best practices and the best tools and technologies available to us to minimize those things, I think, is very important to an insurer.
Beyond the needs of investors and insurers, U.S. natural gas producers also have to take into account regulation from abroad. Places like Europe and Japan are imposing emissions requirements on the producers they import from.
Internationally, what's really interesting is the countries that are starting to look at importing LNG are also looking at standards for that LNG. How is that gas produced? How is it liquefied? How is it shipped? Japan and JOGMEC, the Organization of Metals and Energy Security, the European Union just established methane rules and looking at implementing how those methane rules apply to gas imports coming into Europe.
Jutta Paulus, a German member of the European Parliament, spearheaded the EU's methane regulations, which will ultimately apply to the gas they import from the United States.
It's not a ban of importing that gas, but it will just become more expensive importing dirty gas instead of importing gas where emissions are mitigated.
From the more sophisticated means of monitoring methane emissions, do you have a sense of where the worst problems are?
When we are looking to the US, it really depends on whom you're looking at. There are companies that work quite well on mitigating their emissions. There are companies that work not so well. So the Permian Basin is, let's say, on the not so well side, whereas in Texas there are some companies that are taking action already. So it's really a mixed picture.
We do have a new administration coming to the United States, and the incoming president, Donald Trump, has not always been warm-hearted towards some of the climate initiatives. Do you anticipate this may become part of the trade negotiations going forward as we talk about tariffs increasingly here?
When we look at the gas market worldwide, there will be quite a bit of LNG capacity coming online within this decade. In order to, let's say, still get a good price for US LNG, which of course will be further exported to around the globe, it would be rather a smart move to work on mitigating methane emissions, because Europe is simply the market where you can get the best price for your gas. We pay more than, let's say, Sri Lanka or India or even China. So knowing that the incoming president is always in favor of a good deal, it would be a very good deal to invest little money to get a lot more profit for your product.
As countries look to set standards and impose regulations on their imported gas, certifying emissions will be key, something Jonah's Howard Dieter says they are working on.
As you look forward to complying with whether it's Japan, whether it's Europe, how are you going to certify that in fact it complies with the regulations?
I think a lot of those discussions are in their early stages, but you know, we're working with a team that has the ability to actually show what we do here in Jonah Field from an emission standpoint, to track that across the value chain and deliver a methane molecule to a liquefaction facility on the Gulf Coast with an exact methane intensity and an exact carbon intensity.
Are we looking toward a day when the price of natural gas may be affected by whether you can certify that or not? That is to say, you'll have more of a market, more buyers for some natural gas than for others.
Certainly, being able to demonstrate that you can meet or exceed a standard that a customer sets, I think is very important for not just Jonah, but for our industry.
Monitoring methane leaks is critical for current producers, but what about orphaned or abandoned wells? Many still emit methane, yet no one knows exactly how many there are. Talal Debs spent 15 years at J.P. Morgan, where he helped finance oil companies and also set up the first carbon credit trading desk. Now he runs Zafiro Methane, a company that cleans up these wells and finds new ways to pay for it.
So what's involved in cleaning up an oil field or a gas field?
It really is a crew of 3 to 5 people with a workover rig, it's called, sort of a basic repair rig. You have to get over the well. And then what we do is we go downhole, we do a number of tests, and then we establish 2 different impermeable seals. One that's sort of very deep near the producing zone where the oil and gas was coming from, the other one closer to the surface. If that isn't in place, you're going to get methane leaks, and sometimes very often you would get leaks of liquid hydrocarbon into the water table as well.
Debs describes a systemic problem. For decades, oil and gas companies unloaded aging wells to smaller, underfunded operators who extracted what they could, but then went bankrupt, often because of a drop in energy prices, leaving wells unplugged and leaking methane.
They can't find anyone who's financially responsible to clean them up.
No one owns a lot of these wells.
The reason they're called orphan wells is that no one owns them. Literally not owned by any solvent person, natural person or corporate person.
Estimates of orphan wells with no responsible operator range from 310,000 to 740,000. EPA estimates 3.5 million unplugged wells are abandoned or no longer in use. At $100,000 each to fix them, who is going to pay?
The federal government, through its bipartisan infrastructure bill, had set aside $4.7 billion to the states for this problem. And those monies represent somewhere between sort of 1% and 3% of the overall need. We only plug several hundred wells a year now, which makes us the largest single plugger in North America, which is frightening to think. But we want to be doing several thousand a year in a short period of time.
Given the size of the problem and the expense in really addressing the problem, this sounds like it's really only the government, whether it's state or federal, that are going to be in a position to come in and actually make a difference.
I think the far better solution would be a market solution. And the reason I say that is, look, let's face it, there's no one to pay for it now. We can bring to bear technology to get the least cost execution, and we're building a business to attack the problem.
You mentioned a market solution. You know markets. You worked at J.P. Morgan. They have something to do with markets. Explain to me the market solution. I think I understand the cost side. Where does the revenue or the investment come from?
Sure. This is a little bit of, build it and they will come, right? Yet we're on track. We're sort of between $40 and $50 million revenue business today. And so, there is definitely some revenue. But when we clean up a well, what we're doing is we're delivering actually something of economic good. It's not just a service. We're taking a contaminated site that couldn't be used for anything else and was causing problems for nearby communities, and we've turned it into a valuable piece of property again. And so who pays for it now? Oil companies will pay for it. We often are the service provider of choice. In addition to corporate clients who pay for our services, the carbon markets pay for our services. There's numerous companies out there that, for one reason or another, their stakeholders want them to be investing in environmental cleanup, especially emissions reduction. And that is intermediated largely by what are called environmental markets or carbon credit markets. We're actually engaging with landowners right now who have some of these wells on their property. They just inherited this liability, and there's no way to really pay for it. And the basis of our proposal is, look, we will clean up the oil wells on your property, and we will be responsible for monetizing that. We'll pay for it ourselves because we think we can get enough carbon credits on the back end to more than pay for it.
A lot of people had net zero commitments. Are they going to back away from them?
Well, some of them are already, but I think what the markets are also telling us is certain investor bases, especially in the world of tech and data, simply do require that there is a serious focus on the environmental impact of the energy that's consumed by these data centers for AI, for instance. When our energy companies and our large tech companies that are big power consumers now, energy consumers now, really start to see the industrial logic that we should be funding this ourselves through the markets, I wouldn't be surprised if what is now probably a 100-year backlog of wells that need to be cleaned up gets cleaned up in our lifetime.
Have the markets discovered, or are they in the process of discovering, that contingent liability that's sitting out there?
I don't think they have fully discovered it in oil and gas, but I'll tell you, there's a really important evolution that's happened. Those companies have gone from being mostly interested in showing their investors the new oil and gas discoveries that they've had to living responsibly within their cash flow. And that mantra, which has been the dominating mantra, eventually will beg the question of the cash flows associated with this cleanup.
When you go in to meet with a CEO of a big energy company, what's the response?
The response has really intrigued me. When I meet with a CEO, I explain to them, hey, look, if we did this differently and you accelerated rather than delaying your backlog of retirement obligations, we could do it in such a way that you would be able to borrow more money more cheaply for new drilling, which gives you a return. And your investors, your equity investors, would love the fact that you were, as they were kitchen sinking all these liabilities, just getting right in front of it. And one of my favorite responses was that he said, look, I get it, you're 100% right, but don't forget, I can keep dancing for a very long time. I think it will be potentially a while before the rank and file of investors can understand this is good. But I'm encouraged that the CEOs, they do get it. And we're going to find someone soon, I hope, who's bold enough to be the first one to take the plunge.
Larry Summers of Harvard has been at the center of policymaking and negotiation at the Treasury and in the White House. Larry, we continue to have a flurry of statements, decisions, proposals out of the Trump White House. You joined with 4 other former Secretaries of Treasury to write an op-ed piece this week expressing some concern specifically when it comes to the functioning of the Treasury. Give us a sense of why you're concerned.
I've been an ex-Secretary of the Treasury for 25 years. I've never had occasion to join anything remotely like that. That's because we're in unprecedented territory in terms of problematic administration of the department when the most sensitive payment systems appear to be given over to people who are unvetted, without security clearances, without experience, possibly with political motive. That threatens people's privacy. That threatens cutoffs of payments on which people depend. And that threatens the Constitution in a way we haven't seen challenged since Richard Nixon was president, by thwarting what Congress has appropriated.
And that thwarting what Congress has appropriated goes at the core of a lot of people's concerns. That is to say, the power of the purse under the Constitution is given to Congress. We apparently have an administration now that says, okay, you can appropriate things, I just won't spend the money. What is the problem with that approach? The
problem is that it violates the Constitution Federal courts have indicated, and I suspect there'll be much more strong indications in the days to come, that that is flat out illegal. Look, David, step back from this. There are a lot of things that the Trump administration's doing that many people, including me, don't like. That's something that happens in the push and shove of democracy. But if they start defying court orders, if the judiciary decrees that something is illegal and the government of the United States says that they're going to ignore those judicial orders, and I wouldn't say that's fully happened yet, but if it does, then we're in the worst constitutional crisis we have had in more than a century. People think of Watergate and the Nixon period as having been a threat to constitutional norms, but President Nixon, whatever his faults, did comply with judicial orders. He turned over, for example, the tapes when the Supreme Court insisted on it, even though he didn't want to. If the government starts turning back from judicial orders, we are in a nearly unprecedented place, certainly for a century or more in the United States, and that is really a constitutional crisis. And if that is to happen, and again, I would not say that it has fully happened yet, but if there was to be backing away from judicial orders, it would then depend upon members of Congress, civil society, the business community, how our democracy met that challenge. So I'm going to be worried about a whole set of issues, but at an entirely different level is the question of whether judicial decisions are followed or whether there's a rejection of judicial authority. That's going to be the most important thing for all of us to watch going forward.
So what is going on from the White House? The administration sort of overshadows at this point the Federal Reserve, and yet we had Jerome Powell, the chair, this week testify in front of Congress. It's not an easy job he has right now. He's sort of caught in between. What is your advice for him?
I think the Fed's got to be very careful right now. You know, the last employment report showed upwards revisions in employment growth for the last couple of months. It showed 140,000 jobs, but the San Francisco Fed has a very good analysis they do each month of the weather distortion that found it was 80,000. So the real number was probably above 200,000. And that is faster than the economy can absorb regularly, especially with what's happening to immigration. So not very surprising, wage growth ticked up substantially. Not very surprising, expected inflation of consumers in the Michigan survey ticked up for 1 month and for 12 months. So I think this is a moment, even before you get to the policies that are coming out of the White House, where we've got to be very careful on inflation. And I think that there's a real possibility, it is not a probability, but there's a very real possibility at this point that the next Fed move is going to be upwards on interest rates rather than downwards. And I think this is a especially dangerous moment for any kind of cost shock, any kind of rhetoric that undermines credibility on inflation, any kind of steps that are fiscally irresponsible. This is probably the most sensitive moment we've had for an escalation in inflation since the policy errors of 2021 that set off the significant inflation that we have.
Larry, we enjoy talking with you each week on Wall Street because you live a very interesting life. Part of that life is as an OpenAI board member. That life got a little more interesting this week as we had Elon Musk come in and offer to buy OpenAI. Sam Altman, the CEO, pretty much immediately responded and said, we're not interested in selling. But you're on the board. How much more complicated does that make your life as you restructure that company involving the nonprofit?
You know, the company will speak to that as appropriate if and when the board actually receives an offer, as distinct from reading media reports. You know, the approach that everyone at the company is taking is to focus on developing the best, strongest, most helpful to society, safest products we can. Where that becomes even more important with all the competition we've seen from China. And it's that, rather than these talks about financial transactions, that is the focus of the company.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.